Liquid Assets by Dean Ing. Originally published in the August to September 1979 issue of Destinies, an anthology published by Ace and edited by James Patrick Bain. In 1982, it was republished in a collection of the author's work entitled High Tension, a collection of fact and fiction, and another in 1987 called Firefight 2000. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Liquid Assets. Because she'd had an exhausting week training a young bottlenose, Vicki Lorenz dallied in her bungalow over the standard Queensland breakfast of steak and eggs. And because it was Saturday, the Aussie marine biologists had trooped off to Cooktown, leaving Cape Melville Station to her for the weekend. Or maybe they just wanted to avoid her fellow Americans scheduled to fly in. She couldn't blame them for that. She did not know or care why a research site near the northeast tip of Australia had attracted visiting honchos. Though it was mid-morning in September, the sun had not yet forced its way through the pile of cumulus that loomed eastward over the barrier reef like the portent of a wet summer. She chose her best short-sleeved yellow blouse as concession to her visitors, and faded denim shorts as refusal to concede too much. She flinched when the sun searchlighted through her bedroom window to splash her reflection in the full-length mirror. Short curls, intimidated toward platinum by tropical summers, complemented the blouse, bright against her burnt bronze skin. In 2 years, she thought, she'd be as old as Jack Benny, and her deceptive youthful epidermis would begin its slow sea change into something like shark leather. She tucked the blouse in, assessing the compact torso and long thighs that gave her a passable, if angular, figure with less than average height. It would do, she thought. If Korf had liked it so much, it had to be in good taste. Against her will, her eyes searched out the curling poster she had tacked against the bedroom wall 2 years ago, after Korf's boat had been found. Sunlight glinted off the slick paper so that she saw only part of the vast greenish tube of a surfer's dream wave, which some photographer had imprisoned on film. At the lower left was a reprinted fragment from Alec Korf's Mariner Adrift. The wave is measured cadence in the ocean's ancient songs of pelagic indifference to mankind's rights and wrongs. And knowing that indifference as well as anyone, he'd made some trifling mistake along the treacherous reef, and it had cost him. Correction, it had cost her. Well, no doubt it benefited the reef prowlers. Korf would have been pleased, she thought, to know that his slender body had finally become an offering to the flashing polychrome life among the coral. She turned then, self-conscious in the sliver of light, and made a mocking bow toward the sun. Scuffing into sandals, she padded out to her veranda. It was then that she saw Pope Pius waiting before the sea gate far below, a 3-meter torpedo in gray flesh. She called his name twice, trotting down the path. She knew it was her old friend Pius, even though his identifying scars were below the water's surface. The slender mast of the microcorder on its harness, just ahead of the high dorsal fin, was unmistakable. He heard and greeted her, rearing vertically, the sleek, hairless body wavering as tail flukes throbbed below. He was an adult Griseus. A Risso's dolphin, with exquisite scimitar flippers and a beakless, prominent nose that made the name Pius inevitable. Inevitable, that is, if you had Korf's sense of the absurd. Soon she had activated the pneumatics, the stainless grate sliding up to permit free passage from Princess Charlotte Bay into the concrete-rimmed lagoon. She whistled Pius in, whistled again. Then she clicked her tongue and spanked the water to urge him forward. The cetacean merely sidled near the planking outside the sea gate, rolled to view her with one patient eye, and waited. Vicky sighed and fetched the lightly pickled squid, tossed one of the flaccid morsels just inside the gate. No response. Perhaps the slightest show of impatience or wariness, as if to say, "I'm jack of it, mate, it's dicey in there." Except that Pius was cosmopolitan, no more Aussie than he was Japanese or Indonesian. As usual, she tended to append false values to the people of the sea, and then to chide herself for it. Eventually, Vicky went outside the sea gate and knelt on the wood. Pius rolled to assist her, breathing softly to avoid blowhole spray that could soak her with its faint, alien rankness. She fed him one small squid, earning a rapid burst of friendly Delphinese complaint at her stinginess, and she knew he would wait for her to return. The videotape was fully spent. The batteries should be good for another cartridge, but Vicky took fresh NiCad cells from the lab with a new blank tape cartridge just to be on the safe side. She was hurrying back to Pius when she saw the aircraft dip near. Sure enough, it was one of the heliocouriers, which everybody knew meant that the passengers had clout with American cloak-and-dagger people. On the other hand, there had been a lot of that kind of air traffic in the area for the past fortnight. She was increasingly glad that McEachern and Digby had gone to Cooktown to get shickered. Plastered, she told herself, must revert to American slang for the day. Something seemed to be bothering the big Grisius, she thought, fumbling to replace the equipment on Pius's backpack. He had never refused to enter the sea gate before. Don't get shirty, she thought. If I'm late, it's my bum, not yours. And because of Pius, she was clearly going to be late. The fact of his early return made the tape important, though. The microrecorder operated only when triggered by calls made by Pius himself, and it pinged to remind him of Squid when the cartridge was expanded. That meant he might return once a month, though he was very early this time. 2 years ago it had been once a week, and no one was sure why Pius communicated with his fellows less as time passed. Perhaps he was growing laconic with age, she thought, giving him a pat before she upended the squid bucket. Pius whirled and took a mouthful of delicacies in one ravening swoop, paused an instant to study Vicky, then seemed to evaporate into the bay, leaving only a royal of salt water in his wake. Water and uneaten squid. Boy, you must have a heavy date, she mused. It did not occur to Vicky Lorenz that the big cetacean might be hurrying, not toward, but away from something. She wheeled the decrepit Holden sedan onto the taxi strip, chagrined to see that the pilot had already set his chocks and tie-downs. The portly fellow standing with the attaché case would be Harriman Rooker, from the cut of his dark suit and the creases in his trousers, which might have been aligned by laser. The little weather-beaten man sitting on the B4 bag then had to be Jochen Schuler. Vicky made breathless apologies. I had a visitor who wouldn't wait, she smiled. Dolphins can be a surly lot. So could State Department men. At least you make no secret about your priorities, Dr. Lorenz, Rooker said. It is Dr. Victoire Lorenz. The hand was impeccably manicured, its grip cool and brief, the smile a micron thick. I truly am sorry, she said, fighting irritation, and turned toward the smaller man. Schuler wore rumpled khakis and no tie, his voice a calm, basso rasp, leavened with humor. Forget it, he said. with a shoulder pat that was somehow not patronizing. "It's not as if we were perishable." The imp of extravagance made her say it. "Everybody's perishable in tropical salt. You come here all bright and shiny, but you leave all shite and briny." Schuyler's control was excellent. His wiry frame shook silently, but he only put his head down and grinned. Rooker was plainly not amused. Well, at least she could relate to one of them. The pilot, Rooker explained, was prepared to stay and take care of the courier. He looked as though he could do it all right. The bulge in his jacket was no cigarette case. Rooker selected 3 of his 4 pieces of luggage for the Holden's boot. Trunk, damn it, trunk, Vicky scolded herself. 1, a locked leather and canvas mail sack, required both men to lift. Schuyler lugged his one huge bag into the rear seat. The bag clinked. Perrier water? Booze? Vicky appointed herself tour guide without thinking and drove along access roads until she was pointing out the saltwater pens where young dolphins and other cetaceans were monitored. "We know Destinies has dialectical differences, just as people and honeybees have local variants of language. We're using recorders to identify various subspecies by sonic signatures. I've made friends with a big Risso's dolphin that roams around loose with a video recorder, sort of a linguistic shill. Maybe we can get some idea whether a grampus orca, a killer whale, sweet-talks a little tersiops before he swallows it. Generally, larger species communicate in lower frequencies." She broke off, glancing at Harriman Rooker, who sat erect beside her, his right arm lying precisely along the window frame. "Straightens pictures," she guessed. His left hand was in his lap, and, inexcusable for a trained observer, Vicky realized only then that a wrist manacle bound the man to his equipment. She pulled to a stop, killed the engine. "You didn't come here for a tour," she accused. With sudden intuition, she did not want to know why they had come. Rooker's pale eyes swept her face, hawk bright, unblinking. "No," he agreed. "We're here for an exchange of information and other valuables. A matter of the most extreme urgency, Dr. Lorenz." "Vicky, please," she urged with her most engaging smile. "If I must, I suggest that you tell us what our next move should be." She searched the implacable features, puzzled, then faintly irked. She felt as if she had been thrust into the middle of a conversation she hadn't been listening to. "Well, you could try telling me what information you need and why the urgency." He stared until she grew positively uneasy, and that made her unaccountably angry. Then, "Tell us about Agung Bonjol," he said, softly but cold. Cold. A kid from Jakarta, wasn't he?" "Right, he was with that Wisconsin senator on the R.L. Carson when she sank a few hundred miles south of here last month. One of the 4 people lost." From the back seat, "Some kid." "Thank you, Joe," Rooker said quickly in that'll-be-enough tones. "Nothing more, Dr. Vicky?" "If there was, I didn't read it. I don't pay much attention to the news on any medium, you know." "Apparently. Now, tell us about Alec Korff." The transition was verbally smooth, but for Vicky, it was viciously abrupt. She took a deep breath. "Poet first, I suppose. That's how he liked it, and because he could be acclaimed at that and starve at the same time, he made his living as a tooling engineer. Korff got interested in interspecies communication between cetaceans and humans. His mystic side, I guess. He didn't give 2 whoops about explicit messages, just the emotional parts." Low, but sharp. "You're Sure of that? Long pause, as Vicky studied the sea for solace. Then she said, certain as one person can be of another. He once said that the truth is built from gestures, but words are the lumber of lies. He hated phonies and loved cetaceans. You know, of course, that I lived with Korf. Met him while I was getting my doctorate at Woods Hole, and he was designing equipment for whales and dolphins. Prosthetic hands. They could work with flipper phalanges, underwater vocoders, that sort of thing. When I landed the job here, he came with me. She waited for Rooker to respond. When he did not, she sighed. Korf was happy here. I knew when he was really contented because he'd compose doggerel on serious topics and laugh his arse off about it. Hiding his pearls like a swine, he said. Everybody's heard Mariner Adrift, but did you ever hear 14,000 pounds of God? Pompous and self-deprecating, and hides a great truth right out in the open. The orca's fanged dignity fills me with humility. One is wise to genuflect to 7 tons of self-respect. The killer whale doesn't really have fangs, of course, just teeth a tyrannosaur would envy. Korf knew that. He knew a hell of a lot about cetaceans. Still no response. Rooker was not going to let her off the hook. And 2 years, come November, she recited quickly, fingernails biting her palms. Korf took his goddamn sloop along the goddamn barrier reef and caught a goddamn trade wind squall or something and goddamn it drowned. Is that what you wanted to hear? Quite the contrary, Rooker said, still watching her. Instantly, she was out of the car. I don't know why I let the consulate talk me into this pig-in-a-poke hostess job on my own time, and now it's become cat-and-mouse insinuation, and I won't have it. If you know anything, you know how I felt about Korf. And you can go piss up a rope, mate, she stormed. She slammed the door so hard, the Holden groaned on its shocks. Halfway to her bungalow, afoot, she looked back to see Schuler patiently following. He had a bottle in each hand, so she waited. It seemed a good idea at the time. Given that they knew her fondness for mezcal, how did they know she couldn't get it locally? Vicky considered many such nuances in the next hour, sitting cross-legged with Joe Schuler while they plastered themselves into a thin film on her veranda. At first he answered nearly as many questions as he asked. She learned that he was detached from the U.S. Mine Defense Labs in Panama City, Florida, an expert in experimental sonar video, and no ignoramus on dolphin research either. He had read her papers on cetacean language, but his own papers were classified. He did not elaborate. Schuler even managed to explain his companion's cryptic manner, after a fashion. It wasn't nice, Vicky decided, but it made sense. Okay, she said, stifling a belch. So some nit at Rand Corporation figured Korf was alive and that I knew it. I'm sure he isn't, and if he is, I don't. She shrugged. You know what I mean. So much for heavy thinkers at Rand. Schuler regarded her gravely, listening to port a bit. Why are you so sure? You want it straight? Why was she so willing to bear these intimacies? Something beyond her normal candor was squeezing her brains. Okay. Alec Korf had a few leftover sex hang-ups and very tough standards, but he was highly sexed. Me too. My mother hated him for his honesty about it. She was a tiny little thing, always trying to prove something by vamping him. Then one day she phoned. I was on the extension, and I don't think either of them knew it. She implied she might fly up to see him alone. Korf suggested she could ride a whisk broom and save the price of a ticket. She spread her hands wide. How could I not love a man like that? Anyway, the point is that we clicked. It was like finding the other half of yourself. He played poet for me, and I played floozy for him. With a sly grin. It'd take him years to develop a replacement, I think. Oh, yes, he'd have got in touch with me, all righty. She took a mighty swig, remembering. You can go back to the car and tell Mr. Stiff Corset Rooker all about it. I bet he's blushing about the corset. Schuler laughed and then looked abashed. Vicky squinted hard. You're bugged, aren't you? He's been listening. She saw guilt and a touch of truculence, and went on. You two have been rough-smoothing me, haven't you? He's really the rough and you're really the smooth. How many of my old friends did you bastards interview before I fitted into your computers? She stared grimly at her bottle. She had consumed over a pint of the stuff, and now she had a good idea why Schuler was drinking from another bottle. I don't know about that, Vicky. I was briefed just like Rooker was. He's used to representing the government, negotiating with some pretty weird groups. I'm just a technician like you. Listen, lady, we're hip-deep in hockey, all of us. She flung the bottle far out over the turf, watched it bounce. Not me, I feel bonzer. You're just high. High? I could hunt kookaburra with a croquet mallet, she boasted. Then went down on hands and knees near the immobile Schuler, shouting, That's a bird, Rooker, you twit! Then she saw past Schuler's foolish grin, realized that he carried a shoulder holster too, and sat back. You people scare me. Go away. We're scared too, he said, no longer playing the drunk. As though Rooker were standing before them, he went on. She's about to pass out on us, Harriman. Why can't we drop this interrogation farce and accept her at face value? Or do you have any nasty little questions to add to mine before the drug wears off? Australian slang is compost-rich with unspeakable utterance. Vicky Lorenz had heard most of it and found it useful now. She had not exhausted her repertoire when she began to snore. Joe Schuler waited for a moment, moved near enough to tap his forefinger against her knee. Snores. Drive that heap on over here, he said to his signet ring. She's out. We can put a call through while she sleeps it off. For the record, I say we take a chance on her. Then he managed to carry Vicky inside to the couch and waited for Harriman Rooker. Late afternoon shadows dappled the veranda before Vicky had swept the cobwebs from her mind. To Rooker's apology, she replied, Maybe I could accept those vague insinuations if I knew what's behind them. What's so earth-shaking about that kid, Bonjour? He's small loss in himself, Rooker agreed. He's a renegade Sufi Muslim, pantheist, denied the concept of evil, embraced drugs to find religious ecstasy, learned he could purchase other ecstasy from the proceeds of his drug running, tricks that'd get him arrested in Jakarta if he weren't the pampered son of an Indonesian deputy premier. I take it a deputy premier's a real honcho. Oh, yes, roughly equal to half a vice president for openers. But the elder Bonjol is quite the pivotal figure. He's made it very clear. If the United States wants to keep some leased bases, Bonjol gets his son back. Vicky considered this. If you think I can round up 1,000,000 dolphins and send them out to find the body, forget it. I'm not sure I could even get such complicated messages across in Delphinese. Somebody sure as hell can, Joe Schuler put in. Rooker. You still don't understand. Western media haven't broken the story yet, but it's all over Indonesia. Agung Bonjol is alive, sending notes on driftwood, or was 10 days ago. I think you'd better view this tape, he added, patting the attaché case. It took an interminable 20 minutes to locate a compatible playback machine in the lab. The men stood behind Vicky as she sat through the experience. The R.L. Carson had been a 400-tonner, a small coastal survey vessel inside the Great Barrier Reef with Australian permission, under contract to the United States Navy. The vessel carried unusual passengers, the swarthy young Bonjol with 2 camp followers and Bonjol's host, Wisconsin Senator Distel Meyer. This part of the tape, chuckled Joe Schuler, had been surreptitious film footage saved by a crew member. The good senator had paid more attention to one of Bonjol's young ladies than he had to the wonders of the reef. Thus far it was an old story, a junketeering politician with a foreign guest on a U.S. vessel far from home. Schuler cut through Vicky's cynical thoughts. Now you know why Mayer's so helpful in persuading our media to hold the story. The next stuff I put together at MDL from the ship's recordings. It's computer-enhanced video from experimental sonar equipment. The scene was panoramic now, a vertical view of sandy bottom and projecting coral heads with preternatural color separation. Visually, it seemed as if animation had been projected over a live scene. It was a hell of a research tool, she thought, longingly. The audio was a series of clicks and coos with descending twitter. Vicky punched the tape to hold and glanced toward the Navy civilian. "Don't ask," Schuler said quickly. "I promise you'll be the first non-military group to get this enhancement rig. It may take a year or two. We're working on better—" "That's not it," she said. "The audio, though, isn't it ours?" She reran the last few seconds as Rooker shrugged his ignorance. "The Great White Father Signal," Schuler nodded. "Sure, it's becoming standard procedure for the Navy in such treacherous channels, when they don't mind making the noise, but it won't be any more," he added darkly. Cape Melville Station had developed 2 messages in Delphinese that, in themselves, justified every penny spent on research. The first message was a call for help, repeatedly sent by a battery-powered tape loop whenever a modern life jacket was immersed in salt water. During the past year, over 100 lives had been saved when cetaceans, chiefly the smaller dolphins, but in one documented case, a lesser rorqual whale, towed shipwrecked humans to safety. The device had come too late for Corf, though. The Great White Father Signal had a very different effect. It seemed to make nearby cetaceans happy, to provoke playful broachings and aerobatics, as though performing for a visiting dignitary. "I hope you don't let whalers get a copy of this," Vicky said ominously. "It was intended as a friendly greeting. The people of the sea are too trusting for their own good." "Is that a fact?" murmured Harriman Rooker, his eyebrows arched. "Roll the tape." The tape repeated its record, then proceeded as the Carson swept over sandy shallows, reef fish darting into coral masses that projected nearly to the hull. Then Vicky saw a thin, undulating line of bright brown cross the video screen, rising slightly as the ship approached. Something darted away at the edge of the screen. Something else, 2 somethings, then others, regular brown cylindrical shapes, swerved into view, attached to the brown line like sodden floats on a hawser. One of the cylinders disappeared, suddenly filled the screen, moved away again. Then the varicolored display turned brilliant yellow for an instant. "Concussion wave," Schuler explained. Nearby coral masses seemed to roll as the picture returned, hunks of the stuff crumbling away with reef flora and fauna. Vicky stopped the tape again. Did the boilers explode? The Carson was diesel, said Schuler. It took us hours to identify those drums and the cable, but there's not much doubt it was some of our old munitions. A mine cable barrier, the kind we used in the Philippines 40 years ago. 500-pound TNT charges intended against assault boats. We're not sure exactly how it got to Australia, but we're not ruling out your cetaceans, Vicky. A silent "ah," then quick reruns of the underwater explosion. Vicky's fingers trembled as she flicked the tape to hold again. Much as I hate to say it, she poked a finger against an ovoid gray blur on the screen, that could be a cetacean. Big one, maybe a Sudorka. False killer whale. The sonar says it was live flesh, Schuler responded. Possibly big enough to haul a cable barrier into position. Vicky drummed her fingers against the screen, then flicked off the display. Could this be the work of terrorists? I was picked because of modest experience in that arena, Rooker said. Yes, it obviously is, but up till now we've counted on human leadership. Didn't someone take Bonjol away? You said he was alive. We thought you might have some ideas, Rooker said apologetically. There are thousands of islands to check and not enough aircraft. We've tried. The witnesses, all citizens of the United States except for Bonjol and his 2 child concubines, agree on some uncanny points the Indonesians don't know. 1, there was a second blast while they were filling the inflatable lifeboats. Perhaps the Carson wasn't sinking fast enough? In any case, 2. Almost the moment she went down, every one of the lifeboats was capsized. Not by sharks, in spite of what some of the crew claimed. No one drowned or sustained a shark attack. 2 non-swimmers have tooth marks, proving they were carried back to the lifeboats by dolphins. Distel Meyer himself says he was buffeted, rudely, by something god-awfully big and warm. He shipped a bit of water while it was happening, I'm happy to say. Same thing happened to most of the crew, Schuler added. Vicky to the stoic Schuler. You think they were being visually identified? Rooker. Don't you? Maybe. Vicky stared blindly at the video screen, testing hypotheses, thinking ahead. But this presupposes that a big group of cetaceans knew exactly whom they were after and culled him out of a mob. That's not very credible, she said politely. We're faced by incredible facts, Rooker agreed. Of course, Bonjol's junket on the Carson was previously announced on Radio Indonesia, and in the non-Muslim press his picture is better known than his father would like. Vicky was tempted to offer acid comment on pelagic mammals with radios and bifocals, then recalled that Pius had a video recorder of the latest kind. She tried another last-ditch devil's advocacy. What proof do you have that Bonjol didn't drown? Joe Schuler moved to retrieve the classified tape from her. Show her the glossies, Harriman. Then, as Rooker exchanged items in his tricky attaché case, Schuler went on. Out of 56 people, 4 were missing when they got to the mangroves near shore. 3 were crewmen. They were found in the Carson when drivers retrieved the ship recordings. Bonjol wasn't found. Nobody saw him go under or knows how he was taken away. But if you can believe our Indonesian friends, here's what was tossed from the sea into a little patrol boat off Surabaya a week later, when everybody figured young Bonjol was only a bad memory. He flicked a thumb toward the photographs that Rooker held. The first 3 photographs showed a scrap of metal roughly torn from a larger sheet. It looked as though it had been subjected to salt corrosion, then roughly scrubbed before someone covered it with cryptic marks. Vicky took a guess. Malayan? Bahasa, the official Indonesian language, said Rooker. Roughly translated, saved from American plot by whales. I am on island in sight of land, but sharks cruise shoreline, living on coconut milk and fish that come ashore. I am, etc., etc., Agung Bonjol, son of, etc., etc. I hardly need add that there was no American plot that we know of. She ignored his faint stress on his last 4 words. I'll bet there aren't any sharks around either. Some dolphin dorsal fins look awfully suspicious to most people. In spite of herself, she was beginning to accept this awesome scenario. Dolphins often scare whole schools of fish ashore, right here in Queensland. The Aboriginals divide the catch with them, believe it or not. Silent nods. She turned her attention to the other glossies, fore and obverse views of a second metal fragment. It looked much like the first one, except for a pattern of dots and lines incised on the obverse side, and Vicky admitted as much. The jagged edges appear to fit together, Rooker said, using a finger to trace torn and evidently matching sides of the metal sheets. This piece showed up a week ago. Poor little rich boy. Quote, 3rd day, sick of fish and coconuts. Small whales will not let me swim. Death to evil Senator Meyer and American imperialists responsible. Finder, please remit to Deputy Premier Bonjol, etc. Signed Agung Bonjol ad nauseam. End quote. At least he seems to be rethinking his ideas about evil, Rooker finished. His eyes held something that could have been cold amusement. Vicky tapped the last photograph. How was this one delivered? I thought you'd never ask, Schuler said. It was literally placed in the hands of a research assistant near the study pens at Coconut Island last Saturday by a bottlenose dolphin. Vicky could not avoid her yelp. Oahu? The Marine Labs? You got it. Halfway across the Pacific at flank speed, maybe just to prove they could do it. The pattern on the back is the simplest code you could imagine. 1 for A, 2 for B, but in binary. Easier to peck it out that way. It reads in clear American English. As gooseflesh climbed her spine, Bonjol didn't encode it? No way. Analysis shows Bonjol scratched his message with sharp coral fragments, but our metal sheet was torn and the obverse incised with some tool. The tool was an alloy of iron, lots of chromium, some manganese, a little selenium. In other words, austenitic stainless steel. Now, Rooker put in, do you see why we wonder about Korf? She nodded, letting her cold chills chase one another. More than once, cetaceans wearing Korf's experimental manipulators had escaped the pens, a fact she had mentioned in scholarly papers. But you're implying a lot of subtlety. For one thing, that they've somehow learned much more about human languages than we have about theirs. Unless Alec Korf or someone like him is behind it, Rooker insisted softly. He could have 2 motives: money, politics. Vicky moved away to the lab's crockery tea service because it gave her hands something to do while she considered these bizarre ideas. The men accepted the strong brew and waited until she met Rooker's gaze. with fresh assurance. Not big money because he ran from it. Believe me, I know. She smiled ruefully. Politics? He didn't want anyone governing anyone, which is why he used to say ours was the least of 100 evils. No, she said with conviction. I wish. God, you don't know how I wish. I could believe you. But Corf is dead. I know it here, she added, placing a small fist near the hard knot just under her heart. A searching look passed between the men. She's probably right, you know, Schuler muttered at last. So much the worse, said the diplomat. We are forced to concede the possibility that cetaceans must be classed as hostile, tool-using entities who can interdict us across 3/4 of the globe. Oh, surely not hostile, Vicky began, then paused. All the same, if I were whaling, I might seriously consider some less risky line of work, starting today. Oh, what was the binary message? Rooker's mirth was faint, but it came through. Assurance that young Bonjol was safe, and a demand for ransom in exchange for his whereabouts. What do they demand, a ton of pickled squid? Vicky was smiling back until she thought of the gradual attenuation of data on the Pius tapes. If cetaceans were getting subtler, they would reveal only what they wanted to reveal, and Pius had behaved strangely. She strode to the forgotten tape she had taken from Pius that morning, but paused in disbelief as Rooker answered her question. They demand 10 million Swiss francs, in hundreds. They promised to contact us again and gave Melville Station's coordinates. In a near whisper, Vicky Lorenz held up the Pius cartridge between thumb and forefinger. I have a terrible suspicion, she said, and threaded the tape for playback. She was right, as she had known she would be. Not only did they see an unshaven Bonjol from the viewpoint of Pius just offshore, they could hear the man's excited cries as he struggled with his dinner. The rest was sunlight filtered through deep water, eerie counterpoint to a long series of flat tones and clicks. Vicky shared unspoken surmise with Schuler as they listened. Binary code. Vicky and Joe Schuler easily programmed the lab computer to print out the simple message as Harriman Rooker stood by. There were a few mistakes in syntax, but none in tactics. They would find a red-flagged boat, attach the ransom to it, and tow the float into the bay. They would find Bonjol's coordinates on the same float after the ransom was examined. I've been going on the assumption that it's counterfeit, Schuler grinned to his companion. Unacceptable risk, Harriman Rooker said blandly. We don't know how much they know. It's marked, all right, but it's real. Schuler's headshake was quietly negative, but Vicky saw something affirmative cross his face. It was not yet dark. Vicky hurried from the lab and was not surprised to spy a small channel marker buoy bobbing just outside the sea gate, a crimson cloth hanging from its mast. Vicky drove the Holden to the sea gate with Harriman Rooker while Schuler, in a dinghy, retrieved the buoy. Rooker unlocked the mailbag, shucked it down from the sealed polycarbonate canister, and smiled as Vicky glimpsed the contents. Vicky mentally estimated its weight at 100 kilos, obviously crammed with more liquid assets than she had ever seen. The clear plastic, evidently, was to show honest intentions. She turned as Joe Schuler, breathing hard from his exertions, approached them from behind. Something in her frozen attitude made Harriman Rooker turn before, silently, they faced the little man holding the big automatic pistol. Schuler was not pointing it at anyone in particular. A sardonic smile tugged at his mouth as Joe Schuler staring at the equivalent of $9 million in cash, took one long, shaky breath. Then he flung the weapon into the dusk, toward the tall grass, as hard as he could. "Let's get this crap onto the buoy," he grunted as the others began to breathe again. They towed the world's most expensive channel maker into the bay, hurrying back without conversation, half expecting some dark leviathan to swallow them before they reached shore. They had all seen the buoy plunge beneath the surface like a tiny cork float above a muskellunge. The trio stood very close on the wharf, sharing a sense of common humanity and a little of deliverance as they peered across the darkling water. "Don't worry," Vicky said, finally. "They'll keep their end of the bargain." "That's what I was thinking," Joe Schuler replied. "Back at the car, I couldn't very well do less." As though to himself, Rooker murmured, "The most adept seafarers on the globe, and they could have been such an asset. I don't share your optimism, Vicky. Isn't it time you finally gave up on them? I'm more worried about how they intend to use their assets," Vicky said softly, "and how they'll raise more money when they want it. Anyway," she said, turning back toward the Holden, "you ask the wrong question. The real question is, have they finally given up on us?" She wondered now if Korf had outlived his usefulness to the sea people. One thing sure, his surviving work included more than poetry. Given language, she had said, cetaceans would develop other tools. But given other tools, Korf had argued, they'd develop further linguistically. Since she and Korf had worked to develop cetacean assets at both ends, she knew the argument would never be resolved. But which species would be caught in the middle? She could almost hear the laughter of Alec Korf.